UFC is pretty firmly in the MAGA tent with one political party, and there haven't been many consequences. Do you see any risks with this embrace?
Not for the next 4 years, I don't. I mean, they've won. The right wing cultural movement has sort of primacy now over both our political system and essentially kind of our culture as well. And I think it's far too early to tell whether this will be a long-term good decision, but I think right now it's one that certainly looks shrewd.
Welcome to episode 2 of The Golden Age. I'm so excited to have you with us. On today's episode, we have Jack Crosbie, the author of a Rolling Stone piece that covered UFC's domination and takeover of American culture. This is a really fun interview, and I can't wait for you to listen. Jack Crosbie, welcome to The Golden Age.
Thanks so much for having me, Andrew.
Tell me about the origins of UFC. There was a point when Dana White wasn't involved in the sport.
Yeah, so the UFC runs for almost 10 years before Dana White gets involved. It starts in 1993 as sort of a sideshow promotion put on by a American businessman named Art Davie and the Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner Rorion Gracie. And it's really put on essentially as a marketing event. Rorion Gracie has effectively created this martial art, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, which is a combination of sort of wrestling, grappling, and then a lot of Japanese judo and jiu-jitsu techniques. And he's refined it into what he thinks is a very sort of effective fighting system. And he wants to market it more widely outside of Brazil. It's kind of caught on there. It was actually originally some of the early applications of it was the Gracie family were, at least according to the research that I've read, were sort of supporters of Brazil's military junta at the time, and it was used to train, right-wing paramilitaries. This is kind of part of the legend of it. I'm not sure if any of that has ever been, really officially confirmed, but there's a lot of sort of research and literature that suggests that that was very much the case. But the Gracie family wants to get rich on this, and they want to market it in the United States. So Rorion gets together with Art Davies, and they say, what if we have a martial arts competition in the vein of things that you've seen in TV and movies, in the vein of, of blood sport? Let's get together practitioners from all of these different martial arts styles. Let's hold an event. Let's have them all fight, and let's see who wins and who is the best. And that is UFC 1 in 1993.
And so who is Dana White, and how does he end up in Vegas?
So Dana White comes onto the scene of mixed martial arts much later. He spends his childhood kind of split between Las Vegas and Boston, is in his sort of young adulthood, early 20s. He's working kind of as a boxer size instructor, think sort of cardio boxing classes for, housewives on their at lunch or immediately after turning over the kids to dad when he comes home from work or something like that. But Dana is, he's a talented amateur boxer of his own, but he realizes, that fighting isn't really how he wants to make a living. It's not the business that he wants to be in personally with his, his own brain cells on the line. But he still very much wants to stay involved in this industry. Part of Dana's legend is that he's eventually run out of Boston by Whitey Bulger and the mob. This is a story he's told on many podcasts, the veracity of which is almost impossible to fully confirm, but this is.
Did you look into it?
Into Whitey Bulger and the mob? No, I did not. That was not part of the fact checking process for this story. It was me trying to track down Boston mob figures to confirm whether or not Dana White owed them a small sum of money at some point in the late 1990s. But that is the legend. He moves back to Vegas, and he spent most of his high school in Vegas. And in Vegas, he had become pretty good friends with a set of brothers whose last name was Fertitta, Frank Fertitta Jr. And they are kind of the scions of this very kind of crooked LA casino magnate family. Crooked again is alleged, but it's Vegas casinos in the 1990s. And the Fertittas have a lot of money, and they're very good friends with Dana. Dana gets involved kind of in the fight world in the same way that he was in Boston. He's coaching, boxing class here and there, et cetera, et cetera. At a certain point, he meets a few UFC fighters, and he and the Fertittas get really obsessed with Rorion Gracie's martial art of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. They're down at, he told me that they were down at the gym at Fertitta Enterprises trying to kill each other on their lunch breaks every day. They learn some of this grappling art from a UFC fighter. And eventually Dana kind of ingratiates himself well enough in the local fighter scene that he starts managing some of the UFC's kind of fledgling stars. And his big break, as far as this goes, comes from, as he told me, he's in a contract dispute with the original owner, or the owner at the time of the UFC. I think it was a man named Bob Meyerowitz. You'll have to check that for yourself. I forget the name all the time, but Dana's in a contract dispute with him. He's arguing on behalf of one of his fighters that he's representing, and Meyerowitz kind of snaps in this contract meeting and says, "Dana, I don't have the money. There's no money. I don't even have the money to put on my next event." And Dana has this sort of blood in the water moment, gets off the phone, and he immediately calls his friends, the Fertittas, and he says, "I think we could buy this thing, and I think it's got legs." And that is, this is late 2000, early 2001. And by the end of, 2001, the Fertitta brothers and a company they've created called Zucker LLC owns the UFC. They bought it for about $2 million. And Dana White is installed as the president of the company and has a stake in the company as kind of a finder's fee, even though the money that was put up wasn't his. And he's been in effective control of the company ever since.
And so what did he see in the sport? Did he see it, it as a good business opportunity? He was clearly passionate about fighting. Is that what drove the interest?
I think it's kind of all of the above. Dana had always been interested in fighting. When I asked him a version of this question, when we spoke to each other, I think the first time that we spoke to each other, he said that it was really sort of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and grappling that had really kind of opened his mind as to what combat sports could be. He comes from a traditional boxing background, and I think that's sort of a revelation to guys like that who had, grown up with the sweet science, the noble art of boxing, realizing that there was this whole other world to fighting that nobody was really showing, and that there was the possibility of a sport. By the time Dana White takes over, MMA has been largely codified into a sport that is very close to what it is now. There are rules. The matches taking place are no longer between a Dutch kickboxer who weighs 200 pounds and a 400-pound sumo athlete. There's standardization in what is happening. And I think what Dana sees in it is that it looks more brutal than boxing. It looks more visceral than boxing. There's so much more in it, I think, to a casual viewer that happens in a UFC match than happens in a boxing match. And in a boxing match, it's to the untrained eye. It can be very exciting, but it's sort of two guys kind of slugging at one another's heads for 15 rounds, which can be exciting or it can be not. In a UFC fight, you have people doing kicks, throwing punches, they're rolling on the floor, they're shooting for takedowns, they're tackling one another, they're throttling each other. And I think Dana recognizes very early on that kind of sort of dynamic spectacle is something that people are really going to want to watch.
What role did Donald Trump play in the UFC's survival and early expansion after Dana White buys UFC?
So Zucker LLC, the Fertitta brothers, when they buy the UFC, all they really buy is the trademark to use the name UFC. And I think maybe there's one octagon or something like that gathering dust in storage, or they really don't have a whole lot. Dana told me about sort of going to the offices of the UFC, which were then in New York, and moving everything out to Vegas. And, it was filing cabinets full of documents and not a whole lot else. They'd sold almost everything else in the company for scraps, including the DVD rights to the shows, which Zuffa later on had to buy back, which turned out to be incredibly lucrative. But the company has been sold off for parts. So Dana doesn't actually get his hands on much. So he has to both promote this sport, promote this new company, and build it back up essentially from the ground up. And at the time, mixed martial arts in general, for the reasons that I kind of had just told you, it's seen as a much more brutal sport than boxing. And the boxing lobby, which is very, powerful among the athletic commissions in the states, in Nevada and New Jersey and all of these different places, obviously does not really want MMA to become a thing. At this point, it's Senator John McCain calls it human cockfighting. And there's this sort of whole kind of cultural push against UFC. It's outlawed in a whole lot of states. One of the state athletic commissions that doesn't outlaw it, and state legislatures that doesn't outlaw it, is New Jersey. And that means Atlantic City is open to the UFC. And so Dana's shopping around for venues for his first ever UFC event. And he gets in touch with a, brash, bombastic real estate developer and hotel owner who has a lot of properties in Atlantic City named Donald Trump. And Trump likes Dana. They take a liking to one another. And Trump says, you can put on your first two events in charge of the UFC at the Trump Taj Mahal. And we'll put them on, we'll promote them, and let's see if this thing has legs. And Dana told me that the moment, that was all well and good, but the moment that he knew that there was, to him, something special about Trump, and that Trump had seen something special in the sport, was that Dana told me, he's hosting these events in the Trump Taj Mahal. Trump's a busy guy, or certainly puts off the appearance of being a busy guy. And he comes to the fights. He shows up for the preliminary fights. He sits for the whole thing. A UFC fight card is a long event, much longer than a football game or any other single sport event, because there are a lot of fights on these cards. And Dana White told me for these first events that Donald Trump watched every single one.
And how has that relationship evolved over the years? We know that Dana spoke at the 2016 Republican National Convention. Obviously, they're great friends today. But between that New Jersey UFC fight and the 2016 convention, what was their relationship like?
Yeah, so their relationship really changes with that 2016 Republican convention. How Dana described it to me before was that, they'd done business together and they were friendly, but they weren't friends, like close friends. They weren't dining together whenever they were in the same city. They weren't, calling each other up socially, really. But Donald Trump always had his eye on the UFC. He does this thing, which if you've done reporting on kind of anything in Trump world, comes up time and time again. One of Donald Trump's kind of signature things is that he obviously loves the media and he loves news. He, gets oftentimes printouts of stories each day, or back in those days, he was assumedly getting the newspaper. And Dana told me that one of the first times the UFC got a write-up in the New York Times, that he gets a letter to the UFC offices, and it's a copy of the Times article with a note in it, in Donald Trump's classic giant black Sharpie handwriting, saying like, "Congratulations, Dana, always knew you could do it. Warmly, Donald," or something like that. And Dana said that over the years, those things continue to come in. It's clear that like Trump is watching the UFC. He's watching it, develop and get bigger and bigger. I think at this point, he probably goes to a few UFC events here and there. Dana didn't specifically mention that, but he's kind of been a fixture at these events for some time. And Dana said to me in kind of late 2015, he gets a call from Trump. And the first thing that Trump says is, "Look, you don't have to do this. I won't be offended if you don't do this. And everybody is going to tell you not to do it. But I'm going to run for president. And if I secure the nomination, I'd like you to introduce me at the Republican National Convention." And Dana and Trump have very sort of similar minds when it comes to business and relationships like this, and that personal loyalty to them is sort of their main principle. And the way Dana described it to me was, he said that, Trump was loyal to me and did a really good thing for me when I was just starting out in this business, and he's starting out in a new venture now. The least I can do is do that for him. And so he introduces Trump. And at the time, the UFC's star really has been rising. They have an electrifying star in Conor McGregor. They're starting to, really pull in more sort of highlights, capture more of the attention of the sports world. It's not nearly to the level that it is today, but it is starting to become a kind of well-known culturally significant thing. And this is really kind of the main foundational moment in Donald Trump and Dana White's personal friendship, I think, is when Dana sticks his neck out for him and endorses Trump and effectively the MAGA movement in 2016.
And so, independent of their relationship, UFC became a cultural and political force. Is that Dana White? Is that Conor McGregor? Is that marketing? Is that Joe Rogan? What, drove its popularity outside of the ring, so much so that it became synonymous with, male culture?
It's kind of a combination of all of those things that you've mentioned, right? I think the main part of it is both very smart and aggressive marketing by Dana White and a smart and aggressive business strategy by Dana White, in really getting the sport out to wherever we'll have it and aggressively just charging through, putting on event after event after event and making sure that those live events, Dana is very, very proud of the UFC live event. He likes the pay-per-view. He likes the show that the UFC is able to put on through the TV, but Dana is obsessed with every detail of the live event. He's in person at almost every single UFC event. And there's one effectively every weekend. And he's at the vast majority of them, I would say, taking kind of a personal role a lot of the times in sort of supervising and managing this. And that started very early on in the UFC's history. So there were sort of two things that White did to make the UFC what it is. The first is the live event, which I've just talked about. The second is, he is an aggressive self-promoter. And in those early days, he had a really good ally and someone who was also extremely, TV friendly, a great talker, great on the microphone, as they say in show business and the fighting business. And that was Joe Rogan. So Dana told me that, when they had first bought the UFC, he and Rogan were getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and they were going on every single AM drive time radio show, sports show, in any market in America that they possibly could. And they were talking up this sport. And then they followed that up with, Dana said, we put on live events in basically every city that would have us in America. And he said at the time for combat sports, boxing was very much relegated kind of to the big cities. It was New York, it was Vegas, it was Atlantic City, occasionally LA, right? So if you're someone who lives in Kansas City or Denver, or, you're never going to see, Pacquiao Mayweather, you're never going to see, these massive boxing fights. But you might get a chance to see the UFC, because Dana basically dialed in this live show to anywhere that had, an NBA team or even a reasonably sized college basketball team with a big arena for that. He could put on a show in any city in America. And it would be something that, he likes to say, nobody would ever leave it saying like, I don't ever want to see that again.
He's really the P.T. Barnum of this traveling circus.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a circus. It's a show that comes to town, and these events have developed into these massive sort of week-long, circuses now. They have media days and press conferences and weigh-ins and stuff that are all televised, and they put a lot into that. But the UFC's breakthrough moment, I think, comes with that marketing and the live event, but with a couple of other things as well. Dana starts, of all things, a reality TV show to go along with the UFC called The Ultimate Fighter.
And that was on Spike, and that really, they were banned in many states, as you noted, and television, wouldn't broadcast their fights, and The Ultimate Fighter really put them on the map.
Yeah. And specifically, there's a moment in The Ultimate Fighter 1, which is sort of the first season of this show. And the Ultimate Fighter is a very sort of classic reality TV show of that time, which is a whole bunch of volatile personalities live in a house together. In this case, it's a whole bunch of mixed martial arts fighters live in a house together, and then they're matched up every couple of weeks to fight one another. And it's sort of a single elimination tournament. So they're all in this house. And like, even when they get eliminated, they stay in the house. So you have, sore losers and sore winners and et cetera, et cetera. But they're separated into teams. So they have to help their teammates train, even if they've lost, et cetera. The Ultimate Fighter season 1 comes down to a fight between two athletes named Forrest Griffin and Stephen Bonner. And it airs live on Spike TV. This is the finale of the show, the championship. So these two guys fight. And it is still, to this day, ends up being one of the most sort of incredible and telegenic mixed martial arts fights that has ever happened. It's an absolute, drawn out slugfest of these two guys. They're both, by the end of the fight, just wrecked, pouring blood. And it's this phenomenal showing for what this sport can be. It's brutal, but it's also, you see the tenacity and the heart of these fighters and the wildly precise techniques that they're executing. And this, airing live on a cable TV channel really kind of puts the sport on the map. That's one of the first things. And within the next couple of years, the UFC starts developing some bona fide kind of breakout stars that break out from the world just of mixed martial arts. They have Ronda Rousey, who comes in and kind of single-handedly creates the UFC's women's divisions. Until then, Dana White had sort of been adamant that there would never be women in the UFC until he gets, the blonde, pretty, very telegenic, but also incredibly talented Ronda Rousey, an Olympic judo athlete, who comes in. And, then of course he gets Conor McGregor, who at this point has kind of become a household name, I think, in the sport, and is not an active fighter in the sport anymore. He's very much kind of had a fall from grace, but in the peak of the Conor McGregor years, he's matching one of the kind of most electrifying and outlandish mic and press conference and media personalities with a genuinely generationally talented fighter. He's getting highlight reel knockouts in his fights, and then he's getting on the mic and saying things that get covered by every sports show in the country afterwards.
One of the things I've always been curious about, I think UFC has done a tremendous job on social media with influencers, podcasters. Obviously, we talked about Joe Rogan. Was that out of necessity because mainstream media wouldn't embrace them, or did Dana know that that's where the audience was and that's where his future fans were?
I think that he now knows that, and I think he was early to recognize that as well. But the UFC's done huge amounts of, has been also very successful in traditional media as well.
Totally.
Their current contract is with ESPN, for millions and millions of dollars. They're negotiating a new contract this year, which is expected to go for, an ungodly sum, potentially to Netflix, maybe back to ESPN. But like, there's a huge bidding war for this right now. Dana, I think, does recognize social media, and now it's kind of become a thing. As the UFC professionalizes more, and as Dana starts, constraining more and more control over the organization in general, social media does become one of the only avenues that fighters have to really make money for themselves outside of the organization. And Dana points to that proudly. He says, like, look at all the opportunities we've created for these fighters to get sponsors via social media and do things like that. And, despite the fact that now they can't wear, any gear that's not UFC branded when they're on the UFC, telecasts or anything like that. Social media is a gift and a curse, and the fighters use it, and it's propped up as a thing. But again, if you're a journeyman in the sport and you don't have the enormous social reach of some of the stars, like everything, social media is kind of trickle down economics with not a whole lot of trickle, right? The people up at the very top of the social media pyramid, just like the people that are at the very top of the UFC rosters, often are making extraordinary amounts of money, and everyone else is just kind of scrubbing to get by and maybe picking up a supplement company endorsement here and there, and kind of hawking ads for sports gambling sites. So
he certainly has a unique relationship with his fighters. It's very different than other sports. Can you talk to me about these fighters' efforts to unionize and how Dana reacted and what's on the horizon?
Yeah, the any sort of nascent unionization efforts within the UFC have ultimately been pretty unsuccessful. Which Dana points to all the time. He says the fighters don't really want it. There's a whole bunch of reasons about that. I think, if you wanted to, just be very simplistic with it, it's that, you have a employer who has a company that is entirely built on not full-time, on independent contracted employees who are like, UFC fighters are independent contractors, but they're not allowed to like independently contract for anywhere else either. The UFC, the technical term for what the UFC has is monopsony, which means it's the same thing as a monopoly, but it's where a monopoly is where there's only one supplier for a certain good and service, so you have to buy from that supplier. A monopsony is when there's only one buyer for a specific service, and the UFC operates effectively as a monopsony. They are the only buyer for the service of professional fighting. There are other mixed martial arts organizations that is not technically true, which Dana points to every time he gets these accusations and comparisons. So he says, "Oh, look, we've got the PFL, we've got that everything else," and then when he's criticized from other avenues, he says like, "Oh, those guys are nobodies. These are tiny companies. Why should we even care about what they're doing?" Right? It's kind of this ecosystem. The UFC is by scale so much larger than any of its other competitors. It's really kind of the only game in town. And this is by design. Dana likes this system, both because it makes him a whole lot of money, but also because it retains his level of control and sort of guidance over the sport, which to me, I think, speaking to him personally, is really what he gets out of it. I think it would be simplistic to say that he's only in it for the money. Obviously, he is making sure that the flow of capital within the UFC is heavily concentrated at the top, and that all of it is essentially flowing through the company that he owns, that is now delivering returns for the shareholders that it has. It's now owned by Ari Emanuel's Endeavor Group. But for Dana, I think he loves being this sort of godfather figure of the sport. He loves being the one who's in control of which athletes get their big breaks and which ones don't. And if an athlete he doesn't really like, he has the power to make it much more difficult for them coming through. And if there's an athlete that he does particularly like, he has the power to make it much easier for them to rise through the ranks and get the title shot when they want to get the title shot. And so that in turn incentivizes the athletes to be, loyal soldiers for the army of Dana White a lot of the time. And it's very much sort of a captive system that is structurally set up to self-reinforce itself and keep things the way that they are in the business.
You mentioned UFC is now part of a public company, that's TKO. You would think that aligning pretty openly Dana White with a political movement would have business consequences. I think if anything, it's been helpful for him in UFC. But Michael Jordan famously said that Republicans buy sneakers too. He wanted to bring everyone under the tent. And so in this case, UFC is pretty firmly in the MAGA tent with one political party, and there haven't been many consequences. Do you see any risks with this embrace?
Not for the next 4 years, I don't. I mean, they've won. The right-wing cultural movement has sort of primacy now over both our political system and, essentially kind of our culture as well. And I think it's far too early to tell whether this will be a long-term good decision, but I think, right now it's one that certainly looks shrewd. So a lot of that is because, what we've just discussed, the UFC is the only game in town. If you want to watch MMA, it's not like you can, you can watch the other organizations, but if you want to watch the best of the best in mixed martial arts, and I know people who, because of this and because of the UFC's political slant, that they really don't enjoy watching it. And that's completely fair. But I think, if you are invested fan of the sport as a whole, and you want to watch the best of it, and you can tune out sort of the political chaff to the sides, the UFC is really like, it's what you have to be watching. And Dana knows that. So he knows he has the political leeway to do all of these things. And as far as from a business standpoint, I mean, you know, when has a corporation ever suffered significant consequences for aligning themselves politically with the dominant political movement in the country, right? I think
there might be longer term consequences, but I agree with you that in the short term, it certainly will benefit.
I do think that the real test is, if the Democratic Party or whatever exists in 2028 wins a presidential election, then maybe if they win the House and the Senate as well, if we have a presidential election in 2028, if it's a presidential election that is contested in a two-party system again, sure. If there is a changeover in the American political system, I think, then Dana White's sort of betting big on the MAGA movement could go down as a mistake. But he's been able to pivot before. And I think he's kind of relying on the fact that, it took Americans less than 4 years of Joe Biden being in office to effectively, culturally forget half of the things that Donald Trump said and did the first time he was in office and elect him all over again, right? So I think that if a Democrat wins in 2028, and if we see America culturally shifting back away from some of these sort of conservative chauvinism and social conservatism that the UFC has kind of leaned into at this point, I think that, it's pretty easy for Dana White to now start cutting more ads and promos about the lesbian fighters in the women's divisions, and, engaging with sign on a new big sponsor who is corporate, has much more presence at, corporate pride parades and things like that. Like, it's not, I think he's betting that he'll be able to pivot again if this political moment changes. And right now, I guess that looks like a relatively safe bet.
And I think you open the story here, and this is certainly, it's got to be, if not the peak, one of the peaks of Dana White's life. Tell me about Tell me about that night in November when he walks into MSG. It looks like he's walking into the Coliseum. You've got Trump, Mike Johnson, RFK. It was a total power move. Tell me about that night and what it represented for UFC.
So it was funny, Dana's introduced Donald Trump at every Republican National Convention, the past three when he's run for president. And in Donald Trump's victory speech on election night in November, he brought Dana up on stage afterwards. Dana gave a speech right after Donald Trump. And these two men have, I think, become very close personal friends. So UFC 309 happens November 16th, I believe. So it's, about, less than 2 weeks after the 2024 election. Donald Trump has, he hasn't really been seen. He's been seen in public, but he hasn't really been seen in like at a large
outside of
major...
Mar-a-Lago.
Exactly. Yeah. He's been down in Florida, enjoying the wind, playing golf, et cetera, et cetera. And this event is really his coming out moment of the country. It's his, it's his victory lap. It's everything.
In New York City.
In New York City, in Madison Square Garden. I mean, this is Donald Trump's town. He's an old New York. He loves Broadway. He loves showbiz. Madison Square Garden is the center of the universe to Donald Trump, right? And in sort of America's sporting history, Madison Square Garden is the center of everything as well. And you get Donald Trump making his entrance at the very beginning of the main card. So UFC fights are organized into a preliminary card and a main card. The prelims are sort of lesser known fighters and people coming up through the ranks. They fight. There's a whole bunch of different fights. And then there's the main card, which is typically, 5 or so fights between big headline names. It's a big thing as a fighter when you make it onto the main card. The main card is when the broadcast switches over from regular ESPN to pay-per-view only. It's where all the biggest stars are. So Donald Trump comes out basically right as the broadcast switches over to pay-per-view. And he comes out, there's a Kid Rock song playing. That was the cue we were given from I'm texting my PR guy saying like, what's run a show here? When's he going to come out or whatever? And he's like, it's going to be around the start of the main card. He's actually in the business building already. But, when you hear the Kid Rock song start, that's when it's going to start. So Donald Trump comes out. He walks out. He's got Elon Musk there with him. He's got Tulsi Gabbard. He's got Mike Johnson. He's got RFK. He's got Kid Rock himself. He's got Elon Musk, of course. But next to him, when he walks out, is Dana White. And Dana White effectively, I was kind of laughing about it with a friend. Dana White essentially walks Donald Trump down the aisle to like meet his blushing bride of America all over again, and they're arm in arm at times, like doing the same walkout the fighters do before their fight. And it's, there's 10-minute standing ovation. They've got graphics on the Jumbotron of like a 45 bursting into flames and turning into a 47. And, on the pay-per-view broadcast, Joe Rogan is like ecstatic with glee, and, everybody in the arena is selling it. It's a sea of red hats. Like, I've never seen so many Trump supporters, consolidated in one place in New York City. We know that New York City is a very diverse city, and it's heavily far more conservative than it has a reputation for. But, this was very much a politically homogenous affair, I think. And it was
Totally.
The crowning moment for the second wave of the MAGA movement.
I had a friend there who said that he had been to MSG for numerous events, playoff games, concerts, but he had seen nothing like that night. I want to wrap it up with this. There's definitely a parallel between Dana White and the UFC and Trump and the GOP, and that's they both loom large over their organizations and movements. What are the lessons that you think Trump has taken from Dana White and vice versa?
So that's an interesting question. I think that Dana White's a bit younger than Trump. And obviously Trump was a very sort of established businessman before Dana White really came into his own. So I think Dana has definitely probably learned more than Trump has learned from Dana. I do think that their worldviews are extremely similar, and their approaches to media, I think, are very similar. These are reality TV guys. That's what they are at their core. They're big, get your name in the tabloids and start your reality TV show. Trump really becomes famous to America not as a hotel and business and real estate developer with which by any empirical measure he's actually atrociously bad at. His companies go bankrupt all the time, and he's constantly making bad and shady deals and cheating on his taxes and everything like that, which every real estate developer probably does. So that's not unique to him. But he becomes famous to America for running the reality show The Apprentice and playing essentially a character of himself that he's still playing now, which has now become indistinguishable from who Donald Trump really is as a person, and being that guy on TV. And Dana White very much does the same thing. He starts The Ultimate Fighter, which is a reality show that Dana White often appears on. Dana White walks in kind of like the host of this when he wants to deliver a certain challenge or announce a fight. He's shown on the reality TV show setting the fights, interacting with these fighters and their teams, and expressing pleasure and displeasure at what happens in a fight, So I think that they really kind of, White sort of molds some of his persona a little bit after Trump. I think where there's an exchange that comes into play is because White is a little bit younger, and because White is so heavily enmeshed in a cultural enterprise that is much sort of younger and much more kind of in touch with the average American than even our political system is, that Dana White, especially in 2024, really brings some of that to bear in favor of Donald Trump. The biggest thing that Dana and I talked about, and the biggest thing that, a lot of publications have covered now is Trump's kind of blitz into this new media ecosystem of, the catchphrase that the media has coined now is the manosphere, but of sort of new media, of podcasts, of YouTube shows, of doing events with influencers. And Dana White is very much the one who pushes for that. This culminates, of course, in Joe Rogan, who is the most popular podcast in the world, him endorsing Trump the night before the election. But Dana was pushing for this a long time before that. He was trying to get Trump on Rogan. He was working on both of them separately, Rogan to take a more explicit political stance and Trump to go on the show. But, he was the one making connections with all of these, podcasters and creators that the average American probably doesn't know, but a demographic of Americans knows extremely well. The young, often male demographic of Americans, they know who the Nelk Boys are. They know who Barstool's like Bussin' with the Boys crew is. They know who Barstool Sports is. They know who Theo Vaughn is. They know, and they certainly know who Joe Rogan is, right? And that, I think, is the, value add that Dana White provides in 2024. Because Trump is, again, he's an old school New York guy. Trump's like gold standards, as much as he loves to, hate and decry them, are CNN and NBC and ABC and Fox News and stuff like that. That's what he watches every day. That's what he loves. And Dana really comes in and says, like, these new media organizations have been hugely influential in helping me promote my business. I think they can do the same for you in your political campaign.
Well, everyone should read Jack Crosbie's piece in Rolling Stone magazine, Empire of Blood, How Dana White's UFC Conquered America. Jack, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Andrew.
Thank you for watching and listening to The Golden Age. If you have any comments, please drop us a line at goldenage@politicon.com. Stay tuned for more episodes every week. You can watch us on Politicon's YouTube channel or by subscribing to The Golden Age with Andrew Zucker podcast wherever you listen. I can't wait to see you on the next episode.